This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, Ruth Simmons discusses her book, Up Home, One Girl's Journey. She speaks about her journey from poverty to academia, serving as president of Smith College, Brown University, and Prairie View A&M University. She's interviewed by author Freeman Hrabowski.
Before we get to this week's episode, we want to take a minute to ask for your help. Your financial support will ensure that C-SPAN can continue to produce podcasts that inform you about national politics, introduce you to the latest nonfiction books, and provide valuable historical context to today's news. Make a donation today and be a part of C-SPAN's future. Visit c-span.org/donate.
Ruth, as I was just saying to you, I spent the weekend in Graceland and Daly, and then in that fifth ward of Houston. And I keep thinking about one fundamental question that I was going to start with, and that is, how did you muster the energy, not just to think about the good, the bad, and the challenging with such depth and authenticity, but to have the energy to express it and to say to the world, here is my life, my childhood. What did it take to do that? And what was your motivation?
Well, I suppose the short answer, Freeman, is that it was the love of my students that motivated me, because I found that over the course of my career, people tended to mythologize my accomplishments. And so students continued to come to me and to say, Ruth, tell me how you did this, because so often it seemed improbable to them that a journey like mine could have taken place. And while I tried to reassure them that there was nothing so different about my journey, I think I still never convinced them that this was the case. I was driving up the road along Paradise Pond at Smith one day, and I encountered a student who was trying to get up the hill on crutches. So I stopped the car immediately and said, get in, I'll take you wherever you need to go. And to my surprise and horror, she said, oh no, President Simmons, if you could do what you've done under such difficult circumstances, I can certainly get up this hill on crutches. And that kept coming back to me, this notion that my students had, that something extraordinary had taken place. So what I wanted to do is to give them the true contours of a life lived from moment to moment, with some fortunate things and some unfortunate things, and how by dint of personal interest and determination, one could come to shape a life similar to mine. So I often say this book is for my students, to explain to them fully who I am and how I came to be who I am, so that they understand that their lives can be shaped in a similar fashion.
Great answer. I'm going to go off script in a sense and ask this question. The book shows just how secure you are, again, to talk in great detail about what was wonderful about your childhood, the love, but the challenges. Could you have written this book with this level of depth 25, 30, 35, 40 years ago? What would you say?
Oh, of course not. Well, first of all, Freeman, I have to say that for most of my growing up and the early part of my career, I said nothing of my background. And so my colleagues, my professional colleagues, knew nothing about my origins. I think they thought that I was the product of a middle class existence, and that there was nothing different about my background at all. It was not until And the reason they didn't know anything about it is I carried a lot of embarrassment for a long time about the poverty of my family, about the very difficult circumstances of my childhood, about my parents, and so on. And because of that shame, I suppose, and the fact that I was encountering people who were very different, given where I went to school and given the positions that I held. So I'm around very wealthy people. I'm around people who've never had much difficulty in their lives. And I'm not comfortable unloading on them the misery of my childhood. So it was not until I was named president of Smith, and the New York Times wrote an article about my background that people came to know the circumstances of my early life. And so I just really didn't talk very much about it until then. But here's what I found out after that article came out. Right. I received letters from all over the country from people who were inspired not by the fact that I had been elected president of Smith, but by the fact that I had come from the childhood I came from to become president of a major college. They were inspired by that. So I didn't start talking about the elements of my journey until after that moment, when I realized finally that the most important thing about me may not be what I've achieved. It actually may be about where I've come from. I started to appreciate that after my Smith presidency. And that's from then on, I've wanted to talk more about how I grew up, more about my parents and what they gave to me, and so on. And so the book could not have been written before, I would say, 1995 or 2000.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting that here you are now, someone known as one of the most admired college presidents of the past quarter of a century, and people have always been inquisitive about you. I remember someone asking me if your parents were teachers, because typically that's the story of middle-class Black America, as you know. Yes. And he said, was her mother a French teacher? And the other person said, no, probably her parents were from the islands, because Elle parle français, right? So must have been that, and people didn't know. And so you're absolutely right. People make assumptions because you're polished and because you speak French and because you are with this PhD from Harvard in Romance languages and studied Césaire. It's amazing. And yet you have this background. Let me go back for a minute. We're both children of the South. And everybody in the South knows what we mean when we say somebody is down home. They're being down home. But Ruth, I have to tell you, I've been thinking about the title of this book, Up Home. And you wrote at some point something about the fact that you own the land now that your grandparents owned, that they had, and all of the symbolism of that, and why you returned home. And you talked about that up home being a feeling that somehow down home, you relish that feeling, but up home is a journey. To talk about up home, because if you Google it, there is no significance there in the Googling of it, even if you get my point. So you're giving us new language that some parts of the country may understand, others don't. Talk about Up Home and your title of the book.
Well, it's quite amazing to me in a way that in spite of the harsh conditions under which we lived in Grapeland, yes. We remained always attached to that place. We were shaped by it, indelibly shaped by it. And we always referred to it as the place that we were from. It happens that Grapeland is north of Houston, where we moved. And so when we were going back there to visit our relatives who were still there, we would say we're going up home, which was north of Houston. So it really is directional in terms of saying where we're going. And by the way, most people in my group and my relatives understand perfectly that when I say up home, they know that that's Grapeland, because that's the way we all refer to Grapeland.
Sure.
But I love the notion, frankly, because if I may, I'll talk a little bit about what I was trying to capture with that notion of up home. So there's so much in the Black community that we treasure during difficult moments. I write about my mother's death, the hardest part of the book by far to write. And when I talk about her death, I talk about her going up, in a sense, up home. When we talked about anything in our community there during those difficult days, we used superlatives. So the name of our church was not New Hope. It was Greater New Hope. And so we load on all of these references to a better time, a brighter day, a higher level. And so to me, that was not only the way we refer to our hometown, up home, but it was also an allusion to the way we got over as an oppressed people, always looking for the most positive aspect of life that we could find. And so up home to me says, this is a place that I belong to. It's a place that gave something to me. I'm attached to it. And it also captures my hopefulness about that area in spite of the difficult times that we had there.
That's powerful, very powerful. I have to say that anybody who reads the book will connect to you and your experience with your mother, because all of us who've lost our mothers know that our parents, particularly our mothers, when good things happen and great achievements, we all say it. I wish my mama was here, and it brings a tear to everybody's eye. And even when the others don't know why we're getting teary, we know. And so you the nerve for all of us, Ruth. You really did, in a very special way. You even said about your mother that she remains a puzzle to you. Talk about that puzzle for a moment, would you?
Yes. So I've been haunted all of my life by the fact that as a child, I did not comprehend the magnificence of this woman. In fact, I was rather embarrassed by her. She was modest. She was self-sacrificing. She took no interest in her appearance at all. She never learned to drive. She was not independent as a woman. She was very subservient to my father. She was overly generous to everybody, giving freely anything that she had to help someone. And yet here was a woman who reared 12 children to adulthood. 12. I only had 2 children, and I could barely manage that. And yet here's a woman who did that, who worked in the fields, who did all the household work, who inculcated us with values that she deemed important. She was my greatest teacher. She taught me everything about how to be a human being. But of course, I didn't know that at the time. I was too young and perhaps too foolish to know what a gift she was in my life. And so she haunts my life in a sense, because I'm always I'm always trying to be what she would have wanted me to be. That's my ultimate test. Is this something my mother would value? Is this something? And so I always have to say to parents, you don't understand what children are paying attention to. You don't understand what you mean to them and what you could come to be in their lives because of what you do. And my mother was, I'm sure, completely impervious to the fact that I could have the kind of life that I would have, because what did she have? She had no money. She had no amenities at all. She had no education. She had no fine clothes. She had no enjoyment, really, of modern society at all. And she was not an independent person. So she couldn't have imagined what it would be like for me. And yet, by doing what she did every day, by being the person she was, I took from her everything that I know about how to be a human being. It's incredible to me that as parents, we can do that unknowingly and so powerfully. So partly what I want to say to people is be careful with your children because they are taking from you every day what their life can be.
You know, my grandmother would say right now that your mama is smiling right now, down on you right now, Ruth, for sure. Yeah. Very special. You write in the book that to be born in an environment in which one is legally designated subhuman is a defining experience, and that dominates one's self-image and that blocks any will for ambitious goals. And you talk at great length about family, and you just talked some about your mother, and then you talk about your very complicated father. And I must tell you that as a man, I looked at one of the reviews that talked about all that you teach women about mothers and just the strength of womanhood and what you learned from your mother, from Miss Ida May, from the teachers. But I learned so much in thinking about fatherhood from your book, and thinking about my own situation and my dad, my wonderful dad. But I want you, if you would, because I thought you were so fair. You were so balanced in talking about a very difficult situation. Talk about your dad, would you?
Well, I suppose, some may see my father as a complicated man, but he was very much a product of that era where Black lives were so inconsequential and where the poverty that he experienced was so incredibly harsh. He was one of 5 sons born to a mother who remarried, and her new husband did not want the children of her first husband, who had died, around. And so they put the children out, and they had basically to forage for themselves as essentially homeless kids, these brothers. And so my father used to talk about how hungry he was at times as a child. And he tells this gruesome story of how he once found a possum in the stomach of a dead animal, and he got that possum and ate it as a meal. That's how grim the poverty was and the want was. And yet, in the midst of this terrible situation where they had to rear themselves, essentially, he and his brothers were the closest ever. They loved each other. They sought each other's company as grown-ups. They were close beyond any siblings I've ever seen, because they bonded in this difficult circumstance. Yet, although he knew difficulty, that did not translate into his being a more caring and thoughtful parent. And so we saw him as basically a patriarch. He demanded subservience of everybody in the family, most of all my mother. He had to be waited on, served all the time. And he directed us in terms of what we needed to do, but often was not the hardest working person among us. And so my brothers in particular, my older brothers, I had 7 brothers, were directed to do all kinds of work that would have ordinarily fallen to him, but he passed it on to them. And so he reigned over the household, and sometimes reigned over the household with cruelty to my mother. And that was very hard for us as children to take, obviously. And so I would say that, he was in his own way devoted to my mother, but I never understood that while she lived because he treated her so shabbily. But once she died, it became apparent that he was making great efforts to keep her memory alive, and that he treasured everything that he had of hers. He preserved, and so forth. And he talked about her endlessly. But of course, for us, for his children, we needed more than that as children. And the hardest thing for me was to have her death and then not to have any consolation from my father. She died, and life went on, and we were expected to, as children, we were expected just to accept it and go on. I was in a very bad place for a long time after my mother died because I did not have anyone to help me to understand how to cope with that loss. And certainly not my father, who was not engaged. In addition to that, he had no sense of where the country was going or what the opportunities might be for his children eventually. And so he did not support our going to school at all. When I told him that I wanted to go to college and that I had a scholarship to go to Dillard, I asked his permission to go to New Orleans, to Dillard. His answer was curt. Yes, I could go as long as I did not expect 1 red cent from him. He was very serious about that because he gave me next to nothing for the duration of my college experience. And he meant that he would not help me in any way. He didn't see the value of it. He didn't see where it would lead. And of course, later on, as I began to work as a professional, he came to understand the import of it later on. And I can say that he was quite proud of what I accomplished in my career, but he didn't help at all. And this was consistent with, in a way, what he was like when I was growing up. He was very self-centered, very much paying attention to his needs, but not to my mother's needs, not to his children's needs, not to anybody else's needs.
It's even painful to hear you say that. When I was reading it, Ruth, I just have to ask you. So how did you not become bitter? I just have to ask that. You write it in such a way that you try to give him as much credit as you can, and you look at the larger context. And what role did your siblings play? Because you do talk about the support you got from them. How do you combine those two things when you think about the lack of support from your father and the love among your siblings, and some in particular, including one or two of those brothers, how did you make it through? Help me understand how we help our students sometimes when they find the same kinds of challenges. What helped you to make it through?
Well, first of all, let me say that these things are always more complicated than they appear. And
Yeah.
I was my father's favorite child.
Yeah.
And so people will be who knew that will be surprised at how harshly I judge him, because he did everything that a person of his limited understanding could do to show that I was his favorite child. And I was his favorite because I was the youngest. It was just
You
that
were the
simple.
baby.
And so I would get special things when he went to the store, and he would protect me when my sisters were angry with me, and so on. It felt very much like I was his favorite, and my sisters remind me of that all the time. Nevertheless, when one becomes an adult and you have the ability to really understand what was going on at the time, you begin to see things differently. I loved my father, and when he passed, I was I grieved like everybody else, because I finally, as an adult, understood his limitations. And how he came to be the person that he was. And while he fell short of what I would have preferred, he was nevertheless someone that I understood. I'd like to think that I understood him, and that's why I could reconcile myself with him as an adult. Growing up in a household with 12 children, including me, being the youngest, you can imagine that it was raucous, and that we had all kinds of rivalries, and we had all kinds of challenges among us. But in the end, my mother insisted always that we had to be close to each other. We had to support each other, and we must always, always be a family. Among the many things that she gave us that. And so every one of us has been faithful to that. Every one of us. And so they helped in innumerable ways, of course. By the time when I lost my mother especially, my siblings stepped in. They would feed us, the three youngest children. They would support us when we had things to do in school. They would give us money when we needed it. They would drop everything to help us. And I tell the story in the book of when I graduated from college. My father didn't bother to come to my graduation, but my oldest siblings, 2 brothers and 2 sisters, drove all night to get there and drove right back to Houston. That was a long drive in those days, just to come to my graduation in New Orleans. So we are still just that close today. Every day starts with conversations, a round robin of conversations among the siblings. And that starts at 5 o'clock in the morning and goes on throughout the day. And we may talk to each other many times in the course of the day. We're that close.
Your mother, as I said before, she's smiling. There's no doubt in my mind. She is smiling. You know, you have always been an independent thinker, even as a little girl. Talk about your observations of experiences in church, because even the language that we use in the Black church, most people don't understand what we're talking about when we say somebody gets happy, for example, and those experiences. But if you would talk a moment about how you viewed what you saw in the church as a child, even your observations.
Well, first of all, we're living in Grapeland, when we were living on a sharecropper's farm, there's no entertainment. Of course, there's no television, there's no radio, there's nothing. There are no books.
Yes.
And so the only social outlet in a way that we had was going to church on Sundays and seeing the show in church. And I was fascinated by that because outside of what I saw in my family, I was mystified by all of these wonderful people in church and the way they behaved. And I'm sitting there as a child observing that. And this is real entertainment for me, because there is the service, of course, and the moaning and the emotional aspects of the service, where people are weeping and they're getting happy and jumping up and testifying and then also the fact that they're very carefully and judiciously walking across in the middle of the service because they have to do something, and yet they have nothing to do. They want people to see how they're dressed, their new shoes, their clothes, and so on. So this is unbelievable to me. I mean, imagine what kind of show that is to a kid that doesn't get to see movies or anything else, and yet you have these wonderful people. And then my mother was perspicacious, to say the least, and she interpreted people and judged people. And so I came to understand that there were certain people who mattered and certain people who mattered less. I came to understand that there were certain people who were no account people. Okay, they're corrupt in some way, and they were on her list as someone that we dared not associate with. And so there was all this hierarchy in the human family, where some people mattered and some people mattered less, where some people were supremely good people and other people were supremely evil people. All of this I'm learning as a child from observing what's taking place in church. But here's the thing that also was happening. I was noticing the disjunction between the way that people behaved during the week and the way that they position themselves during the Sunday services. I could see the gap. And so my father, who was trying to become a minister, would be welcomed in the pulpit, and he would be clutching a Bible, and he would be very submissive and give the impression that he was humble, that he was very pious. This was not the man that I saw at home, who was a tyrant, okay, and so on. So I mean, I always say that my early days in church really helped me to begin to observe people and to look behind the veneer to see what people were really like underneath. But it was also tremendous fun, let's face it, having to observe all of this. There's nothing more exciting than being in a Baptist church service or a sanctified church service. There's nothing better than that.
So you just mentioned something about people mattering. Teachers, let's get to the stuff that you and I would consider really fun stuff, and that's about education. It amazes me that even though you didn't have books in your home, even though there were times when you knew hunger yourself, even though you got the chicken feet to eat as the baby, quite frankly.
You had to bring that up. Okay.
I had to bring it up because my wife, who grew up in rural Virginia, talked about chicken feet, and I didn't think anybody else would. And I have had one other person do it. You're the third person I've ever heard about chicken feet from. I'm thinking the sophisticated woman of French literature talking about chicken feet. But with all of those experiences that you got to Miss Ida May in this school, and all of a sudden she somehow was able to let you know how much you mattered, that you mattered. And I want you to talk about your teachers, starting with Miss Ida May. And the one thing, as you talk, if you would, Ruth, when did you begin to love to read? Because that's where I see, as you know, so many of our children never learning to love to read. So please.
Oh my! Well, certainly, it's hard. I suppose for some people who didn't experience their first classroom in the same way to understand the lightning bolt that struck me when I walked into Miss Ida May Henderson's class for the first time. So picture this: I'm a country bumpkin. I'm wearing homemade clothes, probably from flour sacks. I have plaits sticking out all over my head. I have shoes that barely fit. I am an ugly thing walking into this classroom. And my family, being a very large family of 12 children, was kind of known as, you know how people cast aspersions on people with a lot of children. Well, we were sort of regarded as, oh, gee, those Stubblefields, all those children. And so we were not respected, to say the least, as a family. But here I am coming into the classroom for the first time as the youngest of these. And yet this woman greets me as if I'm the Queen of Sheba. And so, oh, come in, baby.
Yes.
How are you? Here's your desk. I mean, a desk for me. I'd never had anything of my own at that point in a large family with essentially 3 rooms in the house. And so here she says, here's a desk for you. Here are your books and your writing utensils. And then I start to do work, and she is amazed. She's, oh, that's wonderful. Oh, you're so smart. I was not old enough to recognize that all of these were probably lies. So I took that in completely and thought, oh my goodness, the first time that I remember in my life anyone treating me as if I actually mattered, okay? Yeah. And that I could do something. And, well, of course, in response to that, what are you to do? You're going to pour your heart and soul into pleasing this person who is a teacher and responding to everything that she gives you to do. And so that's how my learning started at the hands of this magician, who, by the way, was that for every child, not just me. Yes. And so I often say to teachers, you are not allowed ever as a teacher to have a down day when you walk into a classroom, because you don't know if that's the day that you're going to light a fire for a child in that classroom, because that's what she did for me. So I started obviously while in Prairie at that basic level. Then when I came to Houston, when I was 7 years old and continued my education in school in Houston, then I had access to books. There were libraries here, and I could get books free. And so I just started reading, and then I had the notion that, okay, I can have all of these books, an unlimited number of books, really, and I can read the entire library. I thought I could read every book in the library nearby. And I was on a quest to do exactly that, because I was finding from reading then my world was opening up in a way that I could not have foreseen. Yes, I had the day-to-day reality around me in this very poor neighborhood of Houston, but I also had these worlds that I was reading about that were extraordinary, because the descriptions were fulsome, because I could come to imagine places that I had never seen before. I could come to appreciate the world that I was living in was not the only world. And that started in me a quest to know as much as I could about the rest of the world and to just keep reading and acquiring knowledge of these different circumstances. I wasn't trying to become expert at anything. I was just trying to learn about life and the people who were so different from the people I knew. And I also had the sense that, oh, come on. I mean, I knew that we were living a lie in the South. I knew that. I knew that while everything said that I was not worth anything and that I couldn't aspire to be anything but a maid, I knew all of that was a lie. And how did I know that? I knew that because the people that people were representing as being worthless, I knew that they weren't that from my own experience of them. And so I was putting together a landscape, perhaps an imaginary landscape of a world where people were treated, respected, where they were treated more fairly, where they were differentiated as individuals, and so forth. And that's what reading meant to me. It was creating that world for me that was so different from the world that I experienced walking down the street from my house to school, where, cars might pass by and call me nigger, and so forth. I was creating a different world for myself. But it turns out that this whole business of reading was also building my intellectual capacity, building my creativity, and helping me to acquire these magical words that I fell in love with. And so by the time I'm in elementary school and going on into junior high school, I'm completely taken with language and how powerful it can be in opening up all these worlds, in expressing oneself, and in protesting what people are doing and saying. And so I'm now on a journey to acquire not just as many books, but as many words as I can.
And there's our challenge, though, Ruth. I want you to, it's so interesting. You talk throughout the book about having experiences of having to clean somebody else's house, or which sounds so odd given your stature today. But I bring it up because my mother learned to read, and she was 35, 40 years older than you, but because she was a child maid and in a house that had books, and the woman gave her that chance to read a book and to come and talk about the book. And she said the more she read, the better a reader she became. And the better a reader she became, the more she enjoyed the experience. But that her girlfriends, she couldn't get her girlfriends to read enough to become good enough at it. You somehow, without having parents who were with books in the house, somehow you got into that reading and read well enough that you got all those points. How? I'm still back there. You take it for granted, your brilliance or whatever it is, that you just got into that habit. Can you pinpoint it in any way? Because how you got there? Because most of your friends were not doing that. I know you had a little niece, somebody you were in school with. Was it her name was maybe Irma? That was doing well.
Elma, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, yeah, but most were not doing what you were doing, were they?
How can you explain a certain connection that you make as a human being? something that you encounter that has a deep impact on you. How does that happen? Why does it happen? I don't know, but I will say that probably my loneliness had something to do with it. Remember now, I'm the youngest in my family.
Yeah.
And I'm my father's favorite, but I'm not anybody else's favorite in my family. And so what happens in these big families is that there are cliques.
Yeah.
And so you have certain siblings that kind of hang out together, that think alike, and so forth. And right next to me in the family was a set of twins.
Yeah.
And so you know what it's like with twins. They are together, okay, on everything. Yeah. And then next to them is a boy, two boys. And honestly, the boys in my family paid no attention to us at all. Okay, none whatsoever, and don't even approach them as if you want to talk to them or play with them, because that was heretical. Absolutely not. And so you had the two boys, then the twins, and so I'm alone at the bottom. Yeah. And therefore, since everybody in the family had friends in the family, we didn't have outside friends. We only had friends in the family. And I was the last one, and there was no one left for me. Okay, so I had to occupy myself with something, and probably reading was a good thing for me. And by the way, I grew up in a family that treasured physical toil. Okay. That came from being sharecroppers and working in fields where, you know, how much work you were doing was very valuable to the family. And mind work was not valuable at all. In fact, it was to be discouraged. So if you were found sitting around not doing anything or thinking, you were an idler and not worth much. Yeah. So imagine when I came to fall in love with books, the kind of pressure that I got, which was there was something wrong with me. So my older siblings constantly worried my mother about doing something about me, because they were very concerned that I was not a normal child. They felt that that other children would be out playing, and I was sitting inside reading books, and they thought that was aberrant. And so for most of the time when I was growing up, I was thought of as a bookish child who would really never be able to get along in life because I didn't have any social skills and I didn't know how to reach out to people and do all the things that others were busy doing. And I seemed to enjoy this sedentary existence with books as my friends.
Yes.
So it just was a fit for me and my personality, I suppose, that I found respite in these books because of all the things that I was learning about in the books, which of course my sisters didn't understand because they were not readers, and no one really in my family except one of the twins was a reader, and therefore they didn't understand the world of books at all.
Mm-hmm. It is a fascinating story. And you're there in the Fifth Ward, and you're at Phyllis Wheatley High School, and you've got amazing teachers at a time when the best of our race people were teaching in these schools. This was the only place they could go. Talk about that experience and what you got from those teachers and from the cultural experiences and the amazing extra things they did to support you when they saw how extraordinary you were. And what they did.
Well, in those days, our schools were absolutely a village. You know, the proverbial village that it takes. It was that, and then some. These are teachers who were the best of their generation, who just happened to be limited in their employment opportunities. And so they were consigned to teaching in Black schools. They certainly couldn't teach in white schools. Okay. And there were many professions that were not open to Blacks yet. And so teaching was about the most prominent thing that you could do, although there were some who managed to become doctors and so forth. But it was a very prominent position. And so we benefited because these magnificent people were our teachers every day, who cared about us and who helped us understand achievement and who showed young people who came from abject poverty how to make a way through life by learning certain skills and so forth. And they would do everything they could to give you more work than you thought you needed. They were very demanding. They could be in those days because parents were not so active in the schools. And so when a teacher said, you must do X, well, you had to do it. And you better not come home and say that you decided not to do something that a teacher told you to do, because you would be executed for that transgression, right? So teachers were very prominent in the community. They were greatly admired in Black communities in those days. And they deserved it, because here's the kind of thing that they did. I mean, I had a teacher in middle school who took an interest in me and gave me a job cleaning her house. Okay. She obviously could see that I didn't have any means. Yes. And so she basically took me into her family and allowed me to earn pocket money, basically. But at the same time, she would take me around the city and show me different things that she knew I would not be able to see or experience otherwise. Then when I got to high school, I found teachers who had a vision that I couldn't possibly have. And that is, they thought perhaps that things might change one day and that we might be able to do different kinds of jobs. We might be able to go to college. And they prepared us as if they believed that all of what we were living through would fade away. I don't know how they could imagine that world. Yeah. I just don't. But they did. And so my drama teacher, Vernell Lilly, told me, you've got to go to college. And you've got to go to college away from Texas, because you would never survive in a newly integrated Texas university, because you run your mouth too much, you'd get into trouble, you'd never survive. So you've got to go to a Black college where they will tolerate your presumptuousness and so forth. And so she insisted that I go to Dillard, because that's where she had gone to college. And she convinced them to give me a scholarship. And that's how I ended up going to Dillard, because of her. And then when I got ready to go off to college, my mother's gone. Nobody can help me get ready to go off to college. And so my teachers invited me over to their homes, and under the guise that I was going to do a little cleaning. And instead, they invited me into my teacher's closet, and she told me to look in there and pick clothes that I wanted to take off to college. So the bag I packed to go off to college was full of my teacher's clothes that they had given me, so that I would have something to wear when I got to college. Honestly, how do you duplicate something like that? Really?
Such major statement, and what we haven't gotten a chance to talk about, all the cultural experiences they gave you beyond the classroom and taking you out in so many ways. I'm going to ask one final question. I could talk to you all day, Ruth, and this is a question to the consummate college president about her higher education experience. I want people to know that you've spent so much time talking about that foundation for the rest of your life, the childhood experiences and all others, so that people could understand why you are who you are today. You make the statement at the beginning of the book and the end of the book that you are the person, you're not the person you were supposed to be, but rather you are the person you dreamed of becoming. And then you talk in great detail about the Dillard experience, going off to Wellesley, and then moving from theater to the major in languages, and then the wonderful experiences of graduate school before you even get to Harvard, but up the Danforth Foundation. And what I would like you to talk about would be how you combine the study of French philosophers like Sartre and Proust to understand the tension you were experiencing between the childhood experience you had and you're moving into a world of the highest levels of education, how you use your appreciation of languages and philosophy and literature to reconcile the different worlds as you close for us.
Thank you, Freeman. And thank you for your questions. Really, I very much appreciate you and your fantastic achievements. And I feel it's a great honor to have this conversation with you. I was lost when I started in college because I had a fundamental problem. I was this person of poverty and from the outer margins. And I was afraid to lose who I was by being educated. It's a typical problem that a first-generation student has, I suppose. So I'm going off to college, and yet I'm leaving a family mired in blue-collar work and sometimes minimal living conditions. And my mind is going back and forth between the privilege that I have to be educated and to learn so much, and my allegiance to this family who has been everything to me for all of my life. And I'm wrestling with how to reconcile those aspects of who I am. Do I dare become educated to a certain level where I may lose that other part of me? What would I be left with if that were to occur? So I'm definitely looking for ways of trying to reconcile these worlds. First of all, when I encountered philosophers, they helped me to begin to move away from the kind of quotidian concerns that I had, to dwelling in a realm where I could come to reason what I needed to understand. And so that helped me immensely in my young mind because philosophers, of course, are very, the syllogisms and everything connected with logic helps you move gradually from thought to reason to conclusion. And so I was using that to a fairly well. What if this happens? Then that. What is the logical conclusion of that? And so when I got to the existentialists, and they said, frankly, that existence precedes essence, and therefore look to your existence and what you do every day, because that will guide you to what your life can be. And so that happened to me when I was early in my college career, to think about what are the things that I can do concretely that will solve this problem for me. Because I'm going to be the sum of the actions that I take. And will those actions reflect adequately who I am, as opposed to what somebody else's idea is of what I should be? And so I'm starting to cultivate an understanding of who I am, trying to bring in everything that I've experienced as a human being, and then deciding what life should be like for me as a consequence. And so where I settled on is that I should have a life of action. It should be a life that contributes something to the world. It should be a life that appreciates the many different people in the world. And it should be a life that can appreciate my family for who they are and what they have been able to do in their lives and give to me. All of that could be brought together and unified under one vision of what it is to be a human being. I can be who I am with my background, and I can also be in the realm of the most elite and the most people who are most removed from me in experience, and still feel whole as human beings. So that's how it helped me to begin to evolve into a person who could represent fairly who I am and not be afraid all the time that I was either wrong or there was something amiss in the way that I came into the world and the way that I came through my childhood.
Excellent. We could go on and on and on, not just because we're both former presidents, but and children of the South, but because we are human beings who care about people, about education. I thank you, Ruth Simmons, for inspiring us. I don't think there are many sharecroppers' daughters from the Deep South who are can be called a chevalier of the French Legion of Honor. What an amazing story you have. The book is extraordinary, as are you. Up Home.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Félicitations.
Merci.
Thanks for listening to the Afterwards podcast. We want to make sure you know about our latest podcast, Books That Shaped America. It's a companion podcast to our 10-week television series of the same name. We've teamed up with the Library of Congress and selected 10 books from across American history that have had a major impact on our society. Each week, the C-SPAN television program will focus on one of these books and its impact. This companion podcast will give you more background on the book's authors. If you want to learn more about Books That Shaped America, go to our website, c-span.org. The podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts.